Okay, so once you've got everything physically connected together, you need to get onto the computer that is connected to the Ethernet port of the checkpoint. This is the LAN port, right? And of course, you want to make sure that it's powered on and you've given the checkpoint enough time to boot. So we're going to go in now and set it up. Now, if you're not sure what the starting IP address is for the checkpoint, you could, look up and see what's the default IP for it, but it's always best to just check it yourself. So to do that, you're going to open up a command prompt and use good old ipconfig. You don't need to add anything after it. And what we're looking for is the Ethernet adapter, and that's going to show us what the local IP address is on that Ethernet adapter, and more importantly, what the gateway address is. So in this case, our gateway address on this brand new checkpoint is 192.168.8.1. So we're going to go over to our web browser and type in with HTTPS 192.168.8.1 and then a :4434. That's the port by default of the management console. Okay, now it's very likely, in fact almost assured, that you're going to get a warning message like this when connecting to the administrative console on the checkpoint. And the reason is there's not a security certificate installed by default on there's a self-install certificate, but there's not an official certificate. So most browsers, and Chrome in particular, are going to warn you about that. All you do is click Advanced, scroll down a little bit further, and say, go ahead and proceed anyway. Now, if you're in Microsoft Edge or another browser, this screen may look slightly different, but the principle is the same, is it's going to warn you, and you just want to proceed past it to go ahead and get connected in. Okay, so it's going to load the first time connection wizard and then bring it up and walk you through the setup. So we're going to click Next. Now here we can change the default administrator name and set the password. That's a very, very, very good idea. Don't leave it as the default. In fact, I'm not even sure that they really will let you leave it with no password, but I'm going to put in an administrator name of my choosing and a password that I want to use. And you want to make sure that this is a nice, strong password, and they'll tell you if it's not. And my personal recommendation, this is not mandatory, my personal recommendation is that you do check this box for enforce password complexity on administrators. That's going to mean that the password will expire in 90 days, and it's going to need to meet certain complexity requirements. It's just a best practices thing. You don't have to do it, but it's a good idea. And then down here is a checkbox for help us improve product experience. This is the typical thing of, can we collect utilization data? That's really a matter of your personal preference. If you want to do that, that's fine. If you don't, that's also fine. So then we'll click Next. All right, so the next screen comes up and it's going to fill in a default time and time zone here and the date, picking this up from your computer basically. You can either set that manually or you can use NTP, and the default NTP settings have always worked great for me in the US. I assume that they work fine elsewhere. This is what I would consider the preferred method to use NTP, because then it's going to keep your time in sync. Then we click Next. Date and time is not configured on the appliance. What it means is, okay, we've got this date and time here, but we haven't actually imprinted it to the device yet. Do you want to do that? Yes, you do. All right. If you'd like to customize the appliance name, if you've got some kind of a schema that you do that with, you can do that, or you can leave it at its default. If you've got a domain name that you want to kind of incorporate this gateway into, this would be a local domain name. You can put that in here, like if you've got Active Directory of some kind, or you can leave it blank. We're going to leave it blank for the purposes of this test, even though this client does have a a local network, but we're going to set that up at another time. So we click Next. All right, how you manage security settings. If you use central management, you'll know it, and you'll check that. If not, if this is going to be kind of a standalone device, which is what I'm doing here, then we're going to click the local management, and we click Next. All right, now it's the nitty-gritty part. We're going to be configuring the internet connection. Now, whether or not you want to do this with the real settings right now depends on a few different things. If you're already at the client site and you've got this gateway in place, connected to their real internet source, then you want to put in the real internet settings right now. If you're not there, if you're configuring this in a lab scenario or in your own shop, then usually it's probably best to just leave this as DHCP for now, which means that it's going to pick up an IP address on the WAN port automatically. I'm setting this up in a lab scenario, so that's what we're going to do. Even though we've got static IP info for the client, we're not going to put that in yet. We're going to wait until we get the unit on site, or right before it's going to go on site, and we'll do that. So we click Connect. And what Connect here is basically just, it's going to make sure that there's actually working internet there. Now, if you wanted to, you could always configure this unit offline, like not have anything connected to the WAN port and finish the internal and this setup and all that without having internet. And if so, you can just say configure internet connection later. If you want, if you have configure internet connection now selected, it's going to want to be able to successfully resolve this and pick up an IP or that kind of thing at this point. So if you are doing this completely offline, then I would say you're going to need to click configure internet connection later so that it knows not to stop you here and try and troubleshoot and resolve this. In my scenario, I do have a cable connected to the WAN that is giving it internet through my own router. Again, this is a lab scenario. So we click Next. Okay, now the LAN settings. So this is basically with the information that I mentioned that you need to gather earlier. This is where you put in the information for how the local area network is going to be defined on this. And this is a good idea to go ahead and get done now. I mean, that's what the setup is for, right? So the IP address in our test scenario here is going to be 10.0.0.1. And it's a /24 network, so it's 255.255.255.0 subnet mask. Now you notice it automatically updates the DHCP range here. So if you need to have DHCP coming off of the gateway, then this is where you define those settings. And this is not a DHCP tutorial, so I'm going to assume that if you're setting that up, you know what you're doing there. If you need to set it up, you set it up now, including an exclusion range if you need one. In our scenario, this client has an on-site domain controller that handles DHCP as well. So we're going to not have the gateway do DHCP. Now that's going to be interesting. It's something we're going to have to remember here momentarily, because how we got our IP address here, if you remember from the command line, we got 192.168.8.2. That's because DHCP is turned on this router by default. That's how we can connect to it easily. Once we make this switch and it applies, the gateway's not going to be handing out IP addresses anymore. So we're going to have to keep that in mind. Okay? But don't worry, this setting does not apply immediately when you click Next. And in fact, for a while, it will still be addressable at the original IP. That's going to keep us connected to this command console. So anyway, you'll see how this plays out. So we click Next now. Okay, now this is a good time to decide how you want administrator access to work. Administrator access is this console that we're doing this setup in, and later we're going to administrate from. Which networks do you want people to be able to access this from? So you've got the options of LAN, local network, meaning you could only access it from a machine that's on site, inside the network. VPN would be, it's accessible if you connect to this by VPN, and then you're, on a secure network. Or you could have it accessible from the internet. And some people do that, especially for these locally managed units. And there's no problem with doing that, but you got to be really careful. Best practice is, if you're going to have it be accessible from the internet, you want to define specific IP addresses down here so that it's not open for the whole world to connect to. Okay? So that's a security policy thing. That's going to vary from company to company and client to client. For now, we're going to leave it where it's not accessible from the internet. This console is only accessible from the LAN. And later on, once we deploy it, we may change that to enable easier management from the MSP or whatever. So we're going to click Next. We do want it to work on LAN and VPN. All right, at this point, the appliance is going to try and connect to Checkpoint and activate itself. And this has to do with obtaining a license. Whenever you buy a Checkpoint router, it's not just something you pick up off the shelf and plug in. It's assigned to a specific user with a specific license and specific set of applications. And this is where we get into which of these blades do we want to have activated. So in our case, and yours may vary, you're going to know which stuff you purchased here. But in our case, this is a firewall. There's no application and URL filtering, no user awareness. There is remote access. At this time, there's no site-to-site VPN. Now, these things can all be adjusted later, but this is just what should be turned on, when we get started here. And then we're not using the threat prevention scenarios in this deployment. If you were, you want to activate those. They're very, very effective. This is actually what Checkpoint's maybe best known for, is the threat prevention. This is a specific scenario that that stuff's not needed, but in your case, it most likely is something you want turned on. And we click Next. So now the setup wizard will configure those blades, and it's just confirming for us what was done here. Now you notice this little notice here that it says a secondary IP address was set on LAN 1 switch. What's that referring to? Well, that's referring to the fact that, we put in a new local area network address, but the device is still accessible temporarily from the original address. That is basically just there to keep a seamless connection to the device during this setup process, and even shortly after this setup process. If we hover here, it'll tell us a little bit more. So the secondary IP address, is the one that we're connecting to it from, the 8.1. And that will remain in effect until the next time we reboot the gateway. Okay. And now we click Finish. Now the interface is now loading, and you notice it's still loading at that temporary IP address of 8.1. After we've rebooted the appliance, you're going to have to address the device at its new IP. Okay, so that is the initial setup. And you'll see here, there's the internet connection information. It's DHCP. It tells us what the address and network information is. If we go over here to device, we can see how the local network is set up. And at this point, you can do some more advanced configurations if you need to. If your device has Wi-Fi, for example, you're going to be prompted to set all that stuff up during setup, and you can manipulate those things thereafter. If you need different ports on the switch to be VLAN or to go to different networks, you can do all that stuff from here. VPN stuff is all under VPN. So you notice that the VPN blade is turned on, but the site-to-site one is turned off. Maybe yours is on if you had one. Site-to-site works really well on Checkpoint, by the way, assuming it's checkpoint to checkpoint. It's very easy to get set up. That's enough for a separate tutorial on that at some point. So if you had VPN users, for example, you would go in here and set up those users. And let's see, let's just set up one that we can do on here. We're just going to go add, and we're going to say Steve is the username. I'm going to put in a password for him. Let's see. You can give an email address for a remote user if you want to. That would basically give them the ability to do a self-service password reset, for example. We're not going to worry about that for here, or a phone number. And this is just Steve Jobs. And remote access permissions is selected. So that is adding a VPN user. And then if we go over to blade control here, if you want to make sure of how to instruct your end users to connect, just go to how to connect here, and the key piece of information here is the server address, whether or not a port is required on the server address. Now that doesn't, this here of course is an internal IP address because we're on DHCP right now. Once we put in our static IP information on site for the client, then the actual, public facing IP address is going to show up here. So you can't really give these instructions until the device is deployed at the actual client site. One other thing I'll call attention to here is under users and objects. This is where you can add network objects, and that would be like if you've got DHCP reservations from the previous device. You could go in here and add a device. It's a single IP. You tell it what the IP address should be. Give it a name, and then if you wanted to reserve it, you could go in and you could put in the MAC address that was for that device. Like if you're installing this on an existing network as an upgrade to their router, you could recreate those DHCP reservations by adding a MAC address here for those devices. You can also define entire networks. But usually those things are done automatically. Like when you set up a site-to-site VPN, for example, it's going to create an entry over here that represents the network on the other side of the VPN. So those are typically done automatically, but if you needed to modify those or add anything here. Servers are a little different. Servers have to do with devices that need to be accessible from the outside, like maybe there's a port on the firewall that you have to open up for a particular device. So you could define which type of device it is here. Maybe it's a DNS server, for example. And that's not a good example, a mail server. And then you can define which ports and which address it goes to and all that kind of stuff. So that's where those things get defined. Finally, there's administrators and users. Users shows you everyone. So that would be remote access users. It would be people that you've delegated access to this console, and also true administrator users. If you want to just see the list of administrators, just go right one tab below that is administrators, and it just shows you who's in administrative roles. The firewall itself is able to be configured under access policy. And that is where the firewall is at. If you go under policy here, it's going to show you all the different firewall rules for incoming, outgoing traffic, that kind of thing. Let's go back to device here real quick and administrator access. Remember during the setup, it asked us if we wanted to use LAN, VPN, or internet as far as who can access this console. This is where you can go in afterwards and update that if you want to. You can change the port. Be cautious with that, of course. 4434 is a good safe port for that. But you can configure that according to your whatever your security policy is. Under DDNS, if you're not on a static IP and you want to connect it to one of the dynamic DNS services, you can do that here. And there's also a way to register the device with Checkpoint And basically what they will do is, if you use this feature, they will create a public URL for the device. It's basically their DDNS service, but specifically for accessing a Checkpoint device. So you could set up DDNS here just specifically for Checkpoint, and they will provide you with a URL that you can use then to connect to this device, even if you don't have DDNS enabled. Very handy and often overlooked feature. If you need to install certificates, those are also under device. I believe they're also under the VPN menu. But you can go in and install certificates. We'll probably do a separate tutorial on that because it's a slightly different process involved for adding a certificate to this than it would be to, say, adding a certificate for a website or something. That's actually something that I wrestled with quite a bit and got Checkpoint support to help me the first time, and yeah, I'll cover that as a separate tutorial at some point in the future. There's lots of other settings in here. If you're not familiar with Checkpoint, I'd recommend you go through and get to know all the different settings in here. It's lots of useful information that this console can provide to you. So anyway, that wraps it up. This device is now set, and other than setting our external IP address, it's ready to deploy. So if you have any questions, leave them in the comments below. I'll be glad to answer them. And have a great day. Thank you.